Hello everybody. Let us correlate the ovarian cycle with the menstrual cycle in case of implantation. So here I will put the parts of the ovarian cycle, while the menstrual cycle will be considered as a graph. On the vertical axis, let's consider the thickness of the endometrium, which is the mucosa of the uterus, and the horizontal axis will demonstrate the time in days. The menstrual cycle starts at day 0. In average, theoretically, it takes 28 days. So in the middle there will be day 14, and the first 4 days, that's what the menstrual phase takes. And perhaps you remember from the histology of endometrium that the endometrium has 2 different layers, namely the basal layer, which stays the same during the whole cycle, and the functional layer, that changes over the menstrual cycle. The first phase is the menstrual phase. That's when the uterine mucosa is shed and lost, which is accompanied by the bleeding from the endometrial blood vessels that become eroded and are bleeding here. So this takes approximately 4 days. And after these 4 days of the menstrual phase, the endometrium starts to regenerate. For that, a proliferation, multiplication in numbers, is required, so that's why we call it proliferative phase. How so? Let's return to the ovarian cycle. From the histology of ovaries, you might remember that in the cortex of ovary there is maturation and growth of follicles, a cohort of follicles every month, which is stimulated by the follicular stimulating hormone FSH that comes from the adenohypophysis. So there's this maturation of growth and maturation of ovarian follicles. The wall of these follicles is releasing, above all, estrogens, which are strong mitogens, and tissues with receptors for estrogens are responding by cell divisions. So the endometrium is regenerating from the basal layer that has been preserved, and the thickness is increasing. The glands are growing, but they retain a straight tubular shape, not complicated, and the glands still don't contain any secretion. This is accompanied with the regeneration of blood vessels in the endometrium and other changes. So here we have the uterine glands as simple tubular glands. So the thickness increases under the effect of the estrogens. Now the dominant tertiary follicle, usually one per ovarian cycle, is a macroscopic body ranging between 15 to 20 milliliters, and this Graafian follicle will rupture its wall and the wall of the ovarian cycle of the ovaries, thus releasing the oocyte and its surrounding cells, which is called ovulation. So the released cell is the secondary oocyte, because shortly before the ovulation the oocyte has completed the first meiotic division in which it was arrested, and it comes out with a zona pellucida and some of the granulosa cells named corona radiata, or cumular cells from this cumulus ophorus. While the first phase of the growth and maturation of follicles under the influence of FSH was called follicular phase, now after the ovulation comes another phase called luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. The ovulation is triggered by an increase, a peak in secretion of the luteinization hormone, which is also released from adenohypophysis. The same luteinization hormone supports the process of transformation of the rest of the Graafian follicle into corpus luteum. This is called luteinization. And the whole follicle, which after ovulation is filled with blood clot, is transformed into an endocrine organ called corpus luteum. The granulosa cells are turned to granulosa lutein cells. The theca interna cells are turned to theca lutein cells that are producing steroid hormones, estrogens, but mainly in this luteal phase, the gestagens. The most important representative of gestagens is progesterone. Now we return back to the endometrium, which will respond upon being stimulated by gestagens by transforming into secretory phase. So the glands will become more tortuous. They will exhibit signs of secretion, and also the stromal cells of the endometrium will accumulate more lipids and glycogen, thus preparing for the implantation of the blastocyst. The implantation of the blastocyst, if day 14 was the day of the ovulation, and let's suggest the day of the ovulation was the same day as the day of the fertilization, because the time interval when the ovulated oocyte could be fertilized is limited to hours or tens of hours. So let us say also the fertilization occurred at day 14. Then we know that 4 days after that the morula is hatching from the zona pellucida, becoming a blastocyst, and that travels into the uterine cavity, and on the day 5 to 6 it adheres to the endometrium. So that would be, let's say, 5 days after that. 14 plus 5 would be 19. So there is adhesion of the blastocyst to the surface of the endometrium, which is prepared for that using various adhesion molecules. Adhesion of the blastocyst. The implantation starts. The implantation takes another 5 days. So let's say day 6 to day 11, starting with the implantation, starting after fertilization, there's the implantation. So another 5 to 6 days after that, let us say at day 25. After day 25, we got a completely implanted embryo with a syncytial trophoblast digging through the endometrium with the amniotic vesicle and yolk vesicle and the extraembryonic mesenchyma and the trophoblast. Okay, so we have a fully implanted embryo here. Now the corpus luteum has two options. If there is no fertilization and no implantation, it will be reduced to the so-called corpus luteum of menstruation, which turns to a collagen scar. Corpus luteum of menstruation, and a collagen scar called corpus albicans, because the collagen is whitish, and the loss of the hormones will cause the loss of the endometrial mucosa, therefore next menstrual cycle, the onset of next menstruation. However, if the corpus luteum will increase to form a large corpus luteum of pregnancy, which will produce even more hormones than before, this will be the corpus luteum of pregnancy that produces lots of estrogens, lots or amounts of gestagens, mainly the progesterone, and also other hormones related to gestation. Then it maintains the pregnancy at least during the first trimester, before this production of hormones is taken over by the placenta, before the placenta is large enough to take care for the production of the hormones. However, how does the corpus luteum, which is still sitting in the cortex of the ovary, how does it know whether to die or grow? There must be some signal that is decisive for that. Let's return to this layer of the syncytial trophoblast. That is leading edge of the invading embryo during the implantation, and this is producing, among others, an important hormone called HCG, which stands for human chorionic gonadotropin, and this is the signal for corpus luteum not to die and disappear, but in opposite to grow and to become the corpus luteum of pregnancy. So the point here is to use the names of the relevant phases when we're speaking about ovarian cycle, so follicular luteal phase, and the terms relevant to menstrual cycle of the endometrium, which is menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and this after ovulation under the effect of progesterone is the secretory phase. Because the glands are growing, you can find the secretion in the lumen. The stroma is preparing for implantation by accumulating nutrients such as lipid droplets and glycogen, and also the blood vessels become really rich, preparing for the implantation to establish the nutrition, to provide the nutrition for the implanted embryo.